Now, ladies and gentlemen, in looking thoroughly and realistically at the danger to everything we have inherited, spiritual as well as material, and at the cause of that danger, we come to the second of these fundamental reasons for deep and basic anxiety. And putting that matter bluntly at once, the reason is simply loss of faith. Not just loss of faith in God and all of His works, and in the Bible and all of its meaning, but loss of faith in man and his works too, in his reasons for existence, in his purposes, and in his hopes. Now, I know that there are still millions of devout Catholics, fundamentalist Protestants, and faithful Jews in this country who still believe unquestioningly in the divine truths and powers which their Bibles reveal to them, and whose conduct and relations with their fellow men are guided strictly by the precepts of their religious faith, or who at least feel that they have sinned whenever they have transgressed such precepts as understood by their consciences. I have hundreds of good friends in those categories. Let all of us thank whatever God we severally worship that there is so large a remnant of the really true believers still left. We honor them. We need their steadying adherence to the rock of reverence and their aspiration of unwavering obedience to ancient and divine commandments. We desperately need their unshakable confidence in absolutes, in eternal principles and truths, in a world of increasing relativity and transitoriness in all things. We admire them. In fact, as will become more clear later, the young man I admire most of all those America has produced was a fundamentalist Baptist missionary named John Birch. My own obsession with this fight against the increasing forces of evil in the world, which, as already mentioned, caused me to give up my business career and income and any prospect of ever having any peace or leisure again during my lifetime, has been due in large part to my admiration for John Birch, to my feeling that I simply had to pick up and carry to the utmost of my ability and energy the torch of a humane righteousness which he was carrying so well and so faithfully when the communists struck him down. The true fundamentalists in our midst, whether Catholics, Protestants, or Jews, are the moral salt of the earth, of an increasingly savorless earth, where such salt is like a stream of water in a desert. And nothing I say now, nor any of the plans I outline later, is intended to question, weaken, or disturb any fundamentalist faith in the slightest, or to discount one iota its tremendous worth as a core of strength for all that we hope to do. But we must not let our admiration for, dependence on, and feeling of spiritual kinship with the fundamentalists blind us to the visible fact that their number grows smaller every year. Among the people literate enough and ambitious enough to be activists in Europe and America, that is, among the leaders of all levels and in all segments of society, from a factory foreman to the chairman of a political party, whose total influence determines what gets done, what the masses think, and which way community, state, or nation moves on the ideological parade ground. Among this 10% or 20% of the population, or whatever the percentage may be, those who are honestly true believers in a faith which most of them still profess is an ever smaller minority. It becomes increasingly smaller. With every senior class our colleges now turn out, with every novel of the Peyton Place type which the hundreds of thousands read, and with the impact of many of the television programs which millions of viewers see. What is far worse, fully 1/3 of the services in at least the Protestant churches of America are helping that trend. For the ministers themselves are not true believers in the divine names or the divine history and divine teachings to which they give lip service as they go through their conventional motions on Sunday mornings. Some have merely watered down the faith of our fathers and of theirs into an innocuous philosophy instead of an evangelistic religion. Some have converted Christianity into a so-called social gospel that bypasses all questions of dogma with an indifference which is comfortable to both themselves and their parishioners, and which social gospel becomes in fact indistinguishable from advocacy of the welfare state by socialist politicians. And some actually use their pulpits to preach outright communism, often in very thin disguise, if any, while having the hypocrisy as atheists to thank God in public for their progressive apostasy. Now, it may shock the Protestants among you to have all of these things said out loud, but you know in your hearts that they are true. It is also true that while later, perhaps slower, and not yet so far advanced in some of these cases, the same trend of worldly disillusionment and loss of true faith is visible among Catholics, among Jews, among Muslims, among Buddhists, and among the formerly devout believers of every great religion of the world. Now, we must not only know the truth, but must face the truth if it is to set us free or keep us so. And the fundamental truth of our times, ladies and gentlemen, as distinguished from the fundamentalist truth, is just this. Except for the diminishing number of fundamentalists of all religions and the increasing but still quite small percentage of the human race which has fervently accepted communism as a religion or a substitute for religion, with those exceptions, all faith has been replaced or is rapidly being replaced by a pragmatic opportunism with hedonistic aims. And what a fall that is for a race which can boast of once having listened to a St. Augustine, a St. Francis of Assisi, a John Milton, or an Alfred Tennyson. The further and more specific manifestation of that fundamental truth is that in Western Europe and America today, we are living in a spiritual vacuum, exactly as were the Romans after they had lost any real faith in their pagan gods and before the rise of Christianity. In the middle of the 19th century, Lord Tennyson, with not only one of the greatest minds, but also one of the most rational minds, at the very apex of the enlightenment achieved by the Western European civilization, could still write with complete conviction, "Our little systems have their day, they have their day and cease to be. They are but broken lights of thee, and thou, O Lord, art more than they." Compare that with the acutely cynical flippancy of a current gem going the rounds, and which runs something as follows. A life force afflicted with doubt as to what its own being was about said, "The truth I can't find, but I'm creating a mind that may be able to figure it out." And in that comparison, you can see the magnitude of our loss as to a base for our morals, our purposes, and our aspirations. For the next part of the truth we must face is that for the past several hundred years, our morality in Europe and America was tied to a belief in the rewards and punishments delineated by Christian dogma, to the accepted commandments of a very real and very majestic deity, and to the desire of the true believer to become worthy of the love of an omniscient living God. The reality and earnestness of Christian faith was the foundation of our ethics and the substance of our consciences. When Voltaire said that if God did not exist, we should have to invent him, it was a very blasphemous remark, but a very penetrating one as to the dependence at that time of morals, humanitarianism, and purposes on what has since come to be called the anthropomorphic conception. That is, a God in whose image man himself was created. Now, the trouble is that In the minds of a vast majority of worshippers, their God had become too close, too concretely defined, and all the details of heaven and hell and of their God's creation and rule of the earth itself had become too vividly and too rigidly put in place. This whole framework of belief could not withstand the sheer facts and convincing rationalizations of the scientific revolution. When Herbert Spencer relegated his own divine being to the infinitely remote and impersonal classification of a first cause, those increasing thousands of intelligent human beings who followed his convincing analyses found that the celestial palace they had built in their minds began to look empty, unnecessary, and perhaps ridiculous. And by the time Ernest Haeckel came to write his Riddle of the Universe, that palace and all the foundations of dogma and doctrine which supported it were crumbling into tragic ruins. For our fathers and their religious preceptors had become too specific and too finite in their beliefs about the infinite, too egocentric and almost patronizing in their adoption of a deity as himself somehow created primarily to be a father to man. When I went to Sunday school in a country Baptist church 50 years ago, I was taught with a huge chart on the wall to reinforce the teaching and emphasize its accuracy that the world was created in the year 4004 BC. Not 4005 or 4002, but specifically in the year 4004 BC. And I am sure that chart had been drawn and those Sunday school lessons written by good Christians who devoutly believed in their own teachings. A religious faith had somehow come to rest its case in the minds of men on these and similar minute and unjustified projections of its more important certainties. As increasing knowledge of history and science made it more and more impossible for the intelligent mind to accept the projections, the more general and deeper articles of faith began to lose their hold as well. But these deeper articles of faith were, for most men, the straw with which were built the bricks of their consciences. Without this straw, the bricks either did not get built at all, or were shoddy and insecure against the erosion of opportunism or the onslaught of temptation. Throughout many centuries, Christianity, despite all of its splits and schisms, supplied the fabric of morality for the whole Western world through its threats of punishments, promises of rewards, and the humanizing effect of its proffered love by and for a divine Father. But despite all the billions of words that have been written to the contrary, that fabric is now pierced and torn and weakened beyond needed dependability. For a vast majority of those who proclaim themselves Christians today and attend church services do not really and literally believe in either the punishments or the rewards, or even in the physical and biological existence of a divine Father with any interest in their personal lives and actions. The momentum of a former belief and the customs which grew out of that former belief and its momentum still have great value. But the fabric is worn too thin to have its old effectiveness. Now, please do not jump to any conclusions that I want to see Christianity denied, discarded, or even further weakened in the slightest. Exactly the opposite is true, as I hope to make clear when we come back to this subject from the constructive side later. But I am not in favor of trying to reimpose all or any of the strands of a fundamentalist faith or of any particular man's or sex fundamentalist faith, and they all have variations, to impose any or all of these strands on those whose reason, whether right or wrong, has honestly told them that we cannot know such positive things about the unknowable. For that, to me, would be like trying to tie the waves of the ocean together with ropes or to confine them with fishing nets. But I believe there is a broader and more encompassing faith to which we can all subscribe without any of us doing the slightest violation to the more specific doctrines of his own creed or the altars of his own devotion. And I believe it is an ennobling conception, equally acceptable to the most fundamentalist Christian, or the most rationalistic idealist, because its whole purpose is to strengthen and synthesize the ennobling characteristics of each man and the ennobling impulses of his own personal religion. It is a conception which the Baptist John Birch, the Catholic Eliel Balak, and the agnostic Thomas Jefferson would alike have welcomed. And in the short time we can give to so mighty a subject in this particular program, I shall return to it later to the extent necessary for its place in the rest of our discussions. What I am trying to do now, in the last section and in this one, is merely to make a realistic appraisal of our weaknesses. Because without doing so, and being quite honest and realistic about it, we can only dissipate our remaining strength in trying to build fortifications and temples on sinking mud or shifting sand. For not only is this loss of reinforcing faith in the cement of our morals a weakness in itself of immense significance, but like all of our weaknesses, it has been pounced upon by the communists and used and made worse by them with great skill and determination for their own purposes. When an individual American, or any other human being, sees himself as no longer responsible to a divine being, but as merely a living accident, not connected in any way with cosmological purpose, it becomes far easier for him to make his decisions about his own life and actions entirely on the basis of his temporal comforts and the earthly desires of his own personality. If he is the kind of man that wants financial success for the ease or leisure and travel or the prestige which it supposedly brings, and sometimes does, he is not going to buck communist pressures in any way that will endanger that success or handicap his progress. If he is imbued with ambition for power, he is more readily inclined to get on the communist bandwagon if that seems to be the surest road to power, as it certainly does to a great many Americans today. The communists are able to use this lack of moral stamina among their enemies in 1,000 ways to make their own progress easier and the conquest of those enemies more rapid. The most terrible result of this collapse of the rock of faith on which our morality was built is the rise of the immoral man, of which the usual communist himself is the most illustrative example. For an immoral man like Stalin is infinitely worse from the point of view of a humanitarian civilization than an immoral one like Hitler. An immoral man may lie, steal, and murder, the worst of them even without any seeming limit or hesitation, but it hurts his conscience. He is, at least potentially, susceptible to humanitarian or moral considerations to some extent, and if they are presented cogently enough to him. There is even the possibility always that the immoral man may sometime or in some ways repent and make what amends he can for his crimes. An amoral man, however, has simply wiped out his conscience, along with any reason for its existence. He is not immoral, even when performing cold-blooded mass murders, because to him there is no such thing as either morality or immorality. There is only the pragmatic consideration of the advantages or disadvantages to himself for his own personal desires or plans in any action, whether it be the building of a monument or the murder of his wife. And these amoral men, the products of a materialistic and sophomoric disillusionment, who have not yet gone on in their thinking to deeper and more permanent truths, they now stalk in our midst in greater numbers than ever before in history. Now you may wonder why I chose Hitler and Stalin as examples, respectively, of the immoral and amoral man. It's because, just from the widely known facts about them, they make the distinction so clear. Hitler was a monster of the worst order, it is true. Hitler was almost incredibly immoral, but he was not amoral. as is positively and emphatically shown by certain circumstances connected with his death. Carry your mind back to those last hours he spent in that basement in Berlin. His power, his ambitious plans, his whole world had completely caved in, and he knew that in a few more hours he would be dead. So, what was the last thing of any significance that Hitler ever did? He sent for a minister and married Eva Braun. Now, this was a recognition of man's moral code, an act of kindness and understanding toward the woman he had lived with for years, a concession to man's traditions and sense of values that would have been utterly unthinkable for an amoral man. If Stalin, for instance, had been in the same circumstances and any woman with him, no matter how long they had been together, had started importuning him about marriage, there is no slightest question but that he would simply have pulled out a gun and shot her. For Stalin was truly an amoral man, simply without any conscience to which any appeal could be made. Now, such men among the communists, and they are plentiful and highly placed, have no real dedication even to communism. They regard it as merely an expedient means to satisfy their personal ambitions, to do so at least more nearly than with any other star to which they might hitch their wagons. But on our own side of the fence, among the millions who either are or pretend to be non-communists, the amoral man, who has no slightest inner concern with right or wrong, is one of the greatest causes of our constant retreat and one of the greatest dangers to our survival. And he doesn't wear any label. He usually lives up to the appearance of excellent morals because it is expedient for his purposes. And you will usually find him in church on Sunday morning. And I will repeat now, you have to put your minds back to 1958, something I said then, and it won't make sense unless you realize I'm talking in 1958. But as a member of the United States Senate running for the presidency and smart enough to know the strong communist support behind the scenes which he will have to get in order to have any chance of being nominated in 1960, such an amoral man can do a tremendous amount of ball carrying on behalf of the communist aims here in the United States, and he can do an almost equal amount of damage to anti-communist morale in other parts of the world by his well-publicized speeches against Chiang Kai-shek or in favor of the Algerian rebels. Or an amoral man, as the head of a great so-called republic, might have no slightest scruples or concern about its fate or the fate of other nations in the face of communist conquest and of the cruel tyranny of their rule. And I said then that any similarity of characters in this story to any living persons is not coincidental. As to the more normal run of men, whose consciences have been weakened but not abolished by their loss of faith, I tried to cover the various ways many of them are converted into communists or are made to do communist bidding by many different kinds of appeals, pressures, and proselytizing in an article entitled Why People Become Communists. There are reprints of it available for you, and they can always be obtained from American Opinion in Belmont, Massachusetts. And I hope that those of you who have not read it may do so, because the answers given there, although put together by such an amateur as myself, have been passed on by experts like J.B. Matthews as being authentic. In fact, J.B. was kind enough to say it was the best answer he'd ever read to that puzzling question of why people become communists. And these reasons why apparently sane and normal Americans do join up with the communists give a part of the present picture it is important for us to keep in mind in connection with all that we plan and do. But we couldn't take time to go into that complex field here, even if I had not already covered it to the best of my ability in the article which is available. For the chief point of this whole present section of our discussion is a more general one. It runs parallel to the main point in connection with the extent to which the cancer of collectivism has weakened and endangered us. It is that as important and absolutely vital as our stopping the communists has become, and as much as our loss of moral fiber is now deliberately made more rapid and more damaging by the communists for their present and future purposes, even throwing the communists completely out of the picture would not stop the fatal deterioration in our sense of values which is now in process. besides the short-term job of eliminating the communist danger, and Herculean as that job may be, it has to be done in a comparatively short term or it can't be done at all. We have the equally important longer-range job of ending this mass psychological flight towards amorality and of restoring convincing reasons for men once again to strive to live up to moral and humanitarian ideals. Otherwise, there is no chance of saving our Christian-style civilization from self-destruction, and it will merely go down to chaos and to the ultimate serfdom of the weak under the strong more lingeringly than if it is destroyed and its once free members are enslaved by the communists. But whereas stopping the disease of collectivism is a matter of honest diagnosis and drastic surgery, cutting something out, this equally gigantic problem is one of restoration rather than of removal. We have to find something to live for, ladies and gentlemen, that is greater than ourselves, or we surely fall back from the semi-civilized level of existence which man has laboriously achieved into a moral jungle and its inevitably concomitant intellectual darkness. I tried to put the picture of where we are heading in a sonnet to my good friend Alfred Noyes about a year before he died. And because it summarizes as concisely and as expressively as I know how the outlook I have been trying to define, I am asking your leave to read it at this point. To Alfred Noyes, as after Rome, now once again the drapes of ignorance and bigotry and lust may close upon the scene. Insentient dust will bury the forgotten stage, and apes who know not man, his glory and his dreams, his wish to be more worthy of his God, will stalk the earth and wield the brutal rod and stamp upon each tiny light that gleams. Amid the dull collective monotone of universal serfdom will be lost the memory of song and singer. Prone and helpless soon upon the rubbish tossed will die the muse. Let us rejoice to own this one great poet more before the Holocaust. And it is not only the muse of poetry, ladies and gentlemen, that will die of abuse and neglect if man's loss of faith in there being anything in the universe worthwhile except his appetites is permitted to continue. But we do not have to let it continue. Before our very eyes lie all the incentives man needs to set himself back on the road of striving towards moral perfection, true intellectual greatness, civilized relationships, and eternal hope for a still better and greater future, which seemed to him to be such natural goals 100 years ago. Making those incentives understood and giving contemporary man a renewed faith in himself, in his destiny, and in a still greater God than was recognized and worshipped by his ancestors is a task for myriads of dedicated individuals over generations of time. We can only contribute all we are able to its proper beginning. But without such a goal and purpose, all of our efforts simply to stop communism or to destroy an ephemeral conspiracy of gangsters are not only doomed to failure, even if successful, they would but postpone the days of darkness for our children, for their children, and for a race of men that once knew the light. Just because it's been rather solemn here, let's have another intellectual cigarette. These two boys had stolen 3 bags of walnuts. And by the time they stole them, they almost got caught, and they had to get home before their parents wondered what had happened to them. The only thing they could think to do with them, there was an old unused graveyard on the edge of the small town. They rushed there with them, and the graveyard had a gate with 2 cement posts, and the gate was still there, but the fence, the wire fence that went off from both sides of it was broken in several places, so it was easy to walk right through. So they walked through the fence, ran through as fast as they could, and they put these 3 bags of walnuts inside the graveyard. They put 2 of them behind the 2 posts. The cement posts were about a foot or more square, and they stood up 2 right behind the 2 posts. And the third bag, they looked around real quick, and there was a great big tombstone quite close by, the biggest problem in the graveyard. They ran around behind that and put it behind the tombstone. Then they ran home. And after they'd eaten, had a chance to go out again, why, they came and they met there at the graveyard, and they had brought a couple more empty bags with them. So they went right in behind the big tombstone and sat down on the grave, and they poured out the wallets from that bag, the one they had there, and began to divide them. But there was no particular honor nor trust among thieves, so it had to be divided very evenly. So one of them started counting them out into two piles, one for you and one for me, one for you and one for me, one for you and one for me. And count them all out and put them in the bags. Well, it so happened that there were a couple of Irishmen had been lingering too long in the local tavern and having more beers than they should, and began to suddenly realize that their wives weren't going to like it, and it was later than they thought, and they better hurry home. So instead of hurrying the usual way, they were so late and worried, they decided to take a shortcut. And the shortcut took them right down a country lane by this old unused graveyard. So they are feeling no pain anyway, and they come down this lane, and as they come right off against the edge of the graveyard, they hear this voice going, one for you, and one for me, one for you, and one for me. And of course it becomes fairly sepulchral as it goes on for a while. And they don't know what on earth. Their hair shoots up, and they're scared to death, and they come along a little further towards the gate, and one of them says, the faith in God, that's the good Lord and the devil dividing the souls in that graveyard. And the other one stops and they says, yeah. And the voice going, one for you and one for me, one for you and one for me. Well, by this time, they don't have the strength to run. They come up against the gate, so they both lean there against the two gate posts, listening. And here's this voice in there going, one for you and one for me, one for you and one for me. Just then, the boy inside doing, they come to the end. The voice goes this, one for you and one for me, one for you and one for me. Well, that's all there are in here. Now let's go outside and get those two at the gate. I don't imagine they've been found yet. They're still running. Many of you may know of the Duke of Devonshire. I'm sure most of you have heard me tell it. I always love the story. Was the sleepiest man ever to achieve high governmental office in England. This was right after the Napoleonic Wars. They told it on him that he went to sleep one day and dreamed he was making a speech in the House of Lords. And woke up and found it was true. So I've always been, with some of the schedules I keep, a little afraid it might happen to me. It's bad enough to have my audience go to sleep, John, but if I go to sleep too, that's really terrible. I was making a speech, a rather long one, and I kept getting a drink of water and pouring a drink of water. Finally, one old guy down in the second row says, well, I'll be gummed. That's the first windmill I ever saw run on water. All right, ladies and gentlemen, let's start retracing our steps. We began by looking at the actual scoreboard of the communist advance, and by seeing clearly, I hope, how very far that advance has already gone and how imminent and horrible is the danger of the physical enslavement of the whole world, including ourselves. We then went on to the two basic and related underlying problems and dangers which threaten us more slowly, but with results which could be just as fatal. We come now to the question of what is to be done about these problems. And because we should take first things first, and the communist threat certainly has priority as a danger to be faced, we are going to discuss the action program against the communist conspiracy in which we are already engaged. Now, the very first thing we must realize is that there is no easy formula possible, nor brilliant scheme devisable, for beating the communists. Communism is not like a poison to which you simply find the antidote. Its present power and extensiveness have not been created by some grand formula that swept the world, but by the sum total, by integration in the mathematical sense, of an almost infinite number of details done well from the communist point of view. There has been brilliant control and coordination by central authority of the effort of millions of men who have been brought by one means or another to dedicate themselves, body and soul, to separate tiny pieces of the job. As a result of many decades of cumulative effort, the conspiracy is now incredibly well organized. It is so well financed that it has billions of dollars annually just to spend on propaganda. It has the benefit of generations of successful experience. It has one set goal of world rule by any means, to which every act and all of the lives of some 40 million party members are now wholly subservient. And it is guided by men who had to have supreme cunning and ruthlessness to have achieved their present positions within the conspiracy itself. One of the great pretenses of the communists is that socialism is such a wonderful system, or would be, because it does away with that horror called competition, that in a socialist society you do not have competition. And of course, again, the exact reversal of the truth. The fact is that the further socialism goes, the more completely it becomes a communist state, the more vicious and bitter and cruel is the competition among those who want to rise to the top. And the further and worse truth is that nowhere in the whole animal kingdom, not just among men, but nowhere in the animal kingdom is there such vicious, cruel competition as between those fairly near the top in the worldwide communist hierarchy trying to climb higher up. And they want it that way. The communists want it that way. Because as a result, those who come to the top of that horrible, broiling maelstrom are the keenest, cleverest, most ruthless, most cruel that can be found. And you take the 20-some viceroys of the communists in their worldwide rule today, Sukarno and Ho Chi Minh, Mao Zedong, and Fidel Castro, and Gamulka, and you can go on and name them, Nasser, around the world. And they are, every one, the cruel, murderous, criminal type of the worst order. They don't even want, or they don't prefer, the man who is ruthless ideologically, ruthless academically. They want, in every case, if they can have it, a man who is an actual personal criminal in his personal ways. One reason Lumumba, they tried to make so much out of him. Lumumba was, just before the communists picked him up and tried to make something of him, was an ordinary, vicious, robbing criminal, was all. And one reason Castro is such a white-haired boy with the communists, and he is. In my opinion, they expect him to rule eventually the whole Western Hemisphere. And the American commissar and the Venezuelan commissar and the other commissars would be under Castro. And the reason he is such a white-haired boy is that he's got everything. He is incredibly, utterly amoral, ruthless, cruel, and cunning, and has been all of his life. The story goes, that I've been told by people that say they know it's true, I don't know that it's true, and I couldn't prove it, that when Castro was a law student at Havana University, he deliberately shot a man out of a window just to test out his gun. And it's certainly, just to try his gun, see, he was all right, somebody he didn't even know. And it's certainly consistent with his character. And this is the kind of people that the communists want to rise to the top if they have the skill, the cunning, and the ability. Against those, we have, leading the free world, men who get to the top because they know how to kiss babies or make tricky speeches or otherwise appeal to the mass voters who are not brought to the top by the same kind of competition, thank goodness, but at least who are not in many ways qualified to meet this kind of carefully selected leadership so far as the ability and skill goes in trying to bring about what they want. Now, just a minute. Jim wanted to say something, and what was it, Jim?
I just wanted to add that a friend of mine was on the scene when that event happened.
When Castro shot a man out the window? So it definitely is true and could be proved if you ran it down.
Personal testimony.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, I had heard that. Anyway, let me just wind that up by saying that the competition within the top levels of the worldwide communist organization is the most ruthless and cruel there's ever been on this earth, without question. And as I say, I repeat, they themselves want it that way. Now, to go on, this octopus is so large that its tentacles now reach into all of the legislative halls, all of the union labor meetings, a majority of the religious gatherings, and most of the schools of the whole world. It has a central nervous system which can make its tentacles in the labor unions of Bolivia, in the farmers' cooperatives of Saskatchewan, in the caucuses of the Social Democrats of West Germany, and in the classrooms of Yale Law School, all retract or reach forward simultaneously. It can make all of these creeping tentacles all over the world turn either right or left, or a given percentage turn right while the others turn left at the same time, in accordance with the intentions of a central brain in Moscow or Rusko-Menigorsk or wherever that central nervous system may be. The human race has never before faced any such monster of power which was determined to enslave it. There is certainly no reason for underrating its size, its efficiency, its determination, its power, or its menace. But there is one basic consideration of tremendous importance which we must keep always in mind. This is that communism has been imposed and must always be imposed from the top down by trickery and terror, that it must then be maintained by terror. In other words, at least 95% of all the human beings on both sides of the Iron Curtain do not want communism. The job is not to unsell a majority from something they want or think is good for them, but to enable a preponderant majority to resist and refuse something they do not want. Truth, reality, human instinct, and the overwhelming weight of human desire are on our side. We have these points in our favor against a conspiracy which must depend on falsehood, cunning, and terror, utilized by less than 5% of the total population. To feel that we cannot win that struggle is a form of pessimism to which I, for one, shall never yield. In fact, I know from compulsions of human behavior which history makes clear that the human race will throw off this tyranny just as surely as the Greek world, led by Athens, threw off a very similar tyranny imposed by fascist Sparta, or as the French people, in a much more minute parallel, put an end to the reign of terror which was the climax of the French Revolution. The question is when? How far and how long will the communist conspiracy keep moving forward successfully before it is overthrown and scattered to the winds of history? How deeply and irrevocably will we have been infected and ravaged by the disease of collectivism, in the poisoned air of which communism thrives, before the ghouls have been routed? How much of the free world can still be saved from the horror of the communist seizures? Or, and this is entirely possible, ladies and gentlemen, even if the conspirators reach a precarious moment when they do seem to have the whole world in their grip, how soon thereafter can the thin shell of terroristic power be blown to bits, and how much of our civilization saved from damage beyond repair? These questions do not lead to defeatism, nor do they lead to optimism, except of a long-range, patient, and most resolute variety. But they do lead to a realization that this war against the communist tyranny not only must go on, but will go on, with us or without us, until that tyranny is finally overthrown. The socialist ideology may eventually destroy our whole civilization through erosion and stagnation, though I think even that can and will be prevented. But the criminal activists headed by the gangsters in the Kremlin will not survive to survey the damage they have done, even if that catastrophe should come. Of all the examples of the big lie which the communists have told to forward their purposes, the biggest is the lie by Khrushchev that history is on their side. Exactly the opposite is true. We paused for a while over one of these two biggest lies of all the communist big lies, namely that communism was an uprising of the downtrodden masses, which it never is. So let's pause now over the other of these two biggest of all the communist lies, namely that history is on their side. For again, as I said, exactly the opposite is true. In fact, communism is so contrary to the main line of man's undulating, intermittent, but basically steady progress throughout recorded history, that only twice in all of the known record have we had anything like it on any extensive scale. One, of course, was the French Revolution, in which there were compressed into one country and 6 years all of the exact pieces as an embryo of what is happening today to the whole world in about 6 decades. And because of its importance as a rehearsal for the present tragic drama, we shall deal with that subject of the French Revolution and its embryo from which you can project everything going on today at some length. But the one other time in man's history when a similar conspiratorial drive bore similar fruit was during the Peloponnesian Wars in Greece. And the parallel between what happened then and what is happening today is very remarkable indeed. Sparta was then the protagonist of collectivism and Athens of individualism, as Soviet Russia and the United States are today. Let's look first at fascist Sparta as the prototype of the present communist Russia. The similarities, as seen in long-range perspective, may amaze those of you who have never studied this particular subject. Again, there was an ideological front, a pretense. The Spartan oligarchy claimed that they were doing all of this and setting out to conquer the Greek world in order to advance the Lycurgian philosophy and system of government and sociology. Lycurgus had been dead about 200 years before this began to take place. But remember, the Marxian Manifesto was published 117 years ago. And so the speed up in transportation and communication since 500 BC would certainly account for that difference in the time it took for the virus to work and be used. And again, it was sheer pretense. The oligarchy at the top of the Spartan state didn't care any more about Lycurgus and his philosophy than the heads of the Kremlin care about socialism, except as it is a means to them, one of their many means of enforcing their tyrannical rule. The oligarchy at the top in Sparta, corresponding to the people in the Kremlin, and with certain stretching of it, of course, especially as they grew, had all the perquisites of power and everything that was really worthwhile from their point of view in life right in their hands. In Sparta, the freemen numbered about 8%. Against the members of the Communist Party in Russia today, approximately 4.6%. In other words, the members of the Communist Party in Soviet Russia get what there is to give them anything nearly approaching a normal standard of living. And so did the freemen in Sparta. The similarity is very close. Now, below that, in Sparta, you had the slaves and the so-called dwellers around, the people who were not exactly slaves but did not belong to the freemen, the group, numbered about 92%. And in Russia, you have the masses, which equal slaves, numbering about 95%. And the condition is very, very similar, except that the actual slaves in Sparta were probably better off. You can take it from almost any point of view. The ordinary masses in Russia today cannot change jobs. They're told by the government where they must work, what they will be paid, how much that money which they're paid will buy, where they must live, what furniture they can have, how many must live in the same house or in the same room. They cannot even go visiting a relative without a permit. And you can go on down the line. They are slaves by every consideration, and every bit as much as were the slaves in fascist Sparta. And, as a matter of fact, both regimes have had the same trouble with revolts. One of the great constant worries of the Spartan oligarchy was the revolt of the slaves. And there were 2 or 3 very large, serious revolts recorded by history. And you have had the same worry on the part of the Kremlin, one of the greatest worries it has, about the revolts of the enslaved peoples in Russia and in the satellite nations. I have a feeling that enough research could still uncover the fact that the Spartans on some occasions precipitated, helped to inspire and bring about slave revolts at a time when it was most convenient to themselves to crush such revolts with great brutality as a deterrent to future insurrections when it might bother them. But I do not have any historical evidence to prove it. I've never had the chance to try to dig in to see if the parallel even goes that far with what we know the communists have done in that respect quite regularly in the last 15 to 20 years. But the situation was very similar. You had in Sparta, as you do in Soviet Russia, an iron rule, a rigid enforcement of the doctrine that the individual exists for and belongs to the state, exactly as in Soviet Russia. You had in Sparta, and we shall come back to this because of its extreme importance in another connection, because this, so far as history records, is where it started, is where the collectivists first learned of this necessity. You had in Sparta the destruction of the family. No collectivist regime can possibly allow the family to exist as such an important sociological unit. They learned this and began it in Sparta. The male child, of course, was taken away from the family, so-called, from the mother, at the age of 7 and never brought back. The children all looked to the state for everything, as in Russia. In Russia today, as you know, the child does not thank his parents or feel grateful to his parents or look to his parents for anything. He looks to the state, feels grateful to the state, praises the state for giving him the food he eats, the clothes he wears, the room he lives in, whatever shelter he has, the education he gets, any recreation he's allowed, and everything else. It's all given him, provided by the state, not the family. This began in Sparta. You had in both cases the same hardness and cruelty. In Sparta, you remember, the most honored boy in all Spartan history, he was the boy who stole the fox from some animal training ground somewhere, and he was taking the fox back in his coat, inside his coat. And of course this was wonderful, that he had been cunning enough to steal a fox and get away with it and not be caught. But on the way back to the commune where he lived, he met what we would call an officer. And he knew he would be questioned by the officer as to why he was out, and the officer might discover the fox. And there was nothing worse. Stealing the fox, if he got away with it, was fine. But if he got caught, then it was terrible. There was nothing worse than getting caught. So this boy was stopped by the officer, who questioned him and talked to him and could see that something was bothering him. But the boy stood there and answered all of his questions until he dropped dead, because the fox had gnawed out his vitals in the meantime. And while the fox was gnawing out his intestines, the boy had never even shown on his face any pain. Now this was the boy who was held up in all Spartan history as the greatest youngster to be worshipped by the others. Well, in Russia, of course, you've seen instance after instance where the great glorified young people of the ages of 12 or 14 or 15 in Russia are those who have betrayed their parents. If some youngster has heard his mother or his father make some equivocal remark about the communist state, or the Kremlin, or socialists in general, and that boy or girl betrays, reports that to the authorities, then he or she is held up as a great hero or heroine. They are the most honored children in Russia. Actually, in both cases, in case of Sparta and of Soviet Russia, all force and all cunning were both made, have been both made to serve the ambition of the oligarchy at the top to rule the world. In Sparta, the oligarchy wanted to rule the Greek world. To them, that was the whole world. And, of course, the Soviets want to rule what is physically the whole world, and everything is made to subserve that ambition of the oligarchy. All else is pretense. The procedures were remarkably the same. The Spartan oligarchy, having established rigid enough control in its own city-state, began to establish cells within the enemy states, the city-states around it, even all the way into Athens, just as the Soviets have done in the USA. And they established these cells under the pretense of promoting certain ideological purposes, the great advantages of dictatorship against democracy, pretty much the terms, the lines on which they drew, just the opposite. That's why I refer to it as Spartan fascism, fascist Sparta, and communist Russia. The cells, as I say, reached into all the city-states of Greece, and in both cases, as in Athens then, its great opposition, as in the United States today, these enemy cells reached very high into the very top circles in every division of life. And eventually, Sparta established satellite nations, satellite city-states all around it, which it controlled openly, exactly as Soviet Russia controls Poland and Romania and Yugoslavia and a lot of others today. It established this ring of satellite city-states around it. And it continued the drive to subvert Athens and to conquer Athens. And it used wars to stir up troubles, but also perhaps a little more to try to use actual arms for physical contest than the Soviets have, but with not too much difference. And not to drag it out, there's a lot more to mention, to talk about it. I'm sure a lot of things that I've forgotten, besides some I could think of to mention. The main point is that eventually, in about 2 generations, through all of this buildup of the pressures, of one kind or another, Sparta did win and conquered Athens and reached its fascist rule completely over the whole Greek world. And it's interesting to note that the final blow, the most important blow that brought the conquest of Athens by Sparta, was that Athens' most honored citizen, the man to whom for years the Athenians had looked up as their greatest statesman, their leader, Alcibiades, turned out to have been working for Sparta all of the time. And you can think about that parallel wherever you might want to apply it. Now, with regard to Alcibiades, it's rather interesting to note the Encyclopedia Britannica. Even in the very new one, they haven't changed it too much. I was going to say haven't dared to change it too much, but they have softened it a bit. But in the 13th Britannica, the last sentence about Alcibiades was that, I haven't got it in the notes, I think I remember it exactly. Last sentence was that he owed his meteoric career completely to his personal charm and his almost unbelievable capacity for deception. And that's the final remark about him. There's another remark in, I think, the 14th Britannica, that at the end, that he brought grief to all who loved him and betrayed all who trusted him. But I'm not sure that's in the 14th. The one I just gave you is in the 13th Britannica. Anyway, Sparta did take over the whole Greek world. This rule eventually was thrown off in about 1 generation, a little less. If you try to pin it down exactly, it's pretty hard to do. It comes to about 29 years. Actually, by Thebes at the lead at the time, but with the Athenians underneath still pretty much exercising the leadership and push, because the paradise that had been promised, the self-government that all of these different satellite nations, city-states were going to have, just didn't come, any more than the withering away of the state that the present communists have promised just hasn't come. Two both parallel lies, promises that couldn't come. And after the Spartan rule was blown up, and I've forgotten what poet, 19th century poet wrote, all were amazed but none grieved when the Spartan rule was thrown off. They just couldn't believe it. All this immense power that had been there, so complete, was blown to pieces. Everybody was amazed, but nobody grieved. I've forgotten who the poet was, but it was blown up, scattered away, and Sparta faded away rapidly and completely, whereas Athens went on to a new period of great glory. Sparta not only faded away, but it contributed nothing to the current of man's cultural or material progress. You could take a committee consisting of the best architect you knew, and the best art critic you knew, and the best musical critic you knew, and otherwise in all the 8 or 10 divisions you might make of man's culture, and have that committee spend 1 week in this house and on these grounds, and they would come up with a tremendous number of things that we owe to Athens, that we've inherited directly or indirectly from Athens and what the Athenians did. I'd be willing to bet you that that committee in a week's study couldn't come up with one single thing in this house that we owe to Sparta. Nothing. They contributed absolutely nothing. I'd be further willing to bet, if there was any way in the world to make it make sense, as I bet, that if 2,000 years from now, some similar committee could look then into the parts of their civilization, the worthwhile parts, the best things they have, to find what they had inherited from had been contributed by the United States, say, and what had been contributed by Soviet Russia. Let's forget the positive side, just take the other. That they would find absolutely nothing that the communist state had contributed to our culture. Not even in science and medicine, where they claim or pretend something. It's just utterly impossible for that kind of a regimented collectivist state to contribute anything creative that's worthwhile. And I don't believe that such a group 2,000 years from now would find one single thing that they will have contributed, any more than the committee I'm talking about could find one thing that Sparta ever contributed. So that is some consolation, too, in connection with all of this destruction of our civilization that is going on under the communist drive today. We're not tossing a coin in this struggle, a coin which either comes down win or lose. Every effort we undertake, every battle we fight, even if we lose it, and every sacrifice we make is cumulative. Every bit of dedication to the anti-communist cause is worthwhile. The most important consideration is to get the most possible effectiveness out of all efforts, all sacrifice, and all dedication, so as to speed the day when the cumulative total of anti-communist resistance finally overcomes their always overextended framework of their control. Now, obviously, the place for us to begin has been and is in the United States for 2 reasons. First, because it must be our earnest hope and goal to break out of this straitjacket, woven of pretense, deception, audacity, and terror, before it completely encompasses ourselves. And second, because the American support of the international communist conspiracy is now, and for at least 20 to 25 years has been, the very backbone of its strength. People used to say to me, well, gee, Bob, what do you don't want to fight the communists, or do you? You want to have a preventive war? You want to go ahead? You're so worried about them, you want to fight them, have a preventive war to stop them? And I say, heavens, no. I don't want any preventive war, or any war at all. Well, then how in the world do you propose to beat the communist conspiracy? I said, it's very, very simple. Just stop helping them. All you have to do. You get our government to stop helping the communists all over the world. Just quit helping them. Don't fight them. Don't oppose them. Nothing. Quit helping. It'll fall to pieces in 6 months. Completely to pieces in 6 months. It's the help of our government all over the world, everywhere. And now more than our government, of some of our people in other divisions too, that has kept the communist conspiracy alive and growing and moving towards the point of total rule. So that is one reason why we have started, and should continue our primary efforts right here. If and when we can reach the point of turning just the American government from actively helping the communist conspiracy everywhere in the world, we shall have won the most important battle in this whole war. For this purpose, we need to do everything we can which will directly affect the actions and decisions of the men in government. We need to enlighten and encourage those on our side to frighten and slow down those on the other side. But of course, the one ultimately sure way of achieving this reversal is to awaken enough local leaders among an apathetic American people before the continuous brainwashing by the left makes it impossible, to the point of generating public pressures that will force the slowdown and reversal. Now, the amount of work required to do that in the face of the way the cards have been so painstakingly stacked against us is something to contemplate. And yet, ladies and gentlemen, there is nothing but work and more work, thinking and more thinking, dedication and more dedication, which will do the job. So now let's look at this job to be done and how we are going about it. Our whole purpose has been and is simply to create understanding. For obviously, if enough people in the United States really understood what has happened in other countries and is now happening in our own, it couldn't happen at all. First, we realized that not only are the mass media of communication overwhelmingly slanted against us, because that's one of the very first places where the communists begin their infiltration to establish their influence. And maybe let me pause here to point out, the communists need 3%. I don't think they have anywhere near that percentage except in the Protestant ministry. I'm pretty sure I said that. With regard to education, there's about 1.5 million teachers and administrators in America. I don't think they have over 1%. The question always is where they have them. With regard to our federal government, I don't think they yet have 2%. The question is where they are. And you can take every division and the percentage is still way under 3 with the one exception. However, even with 1% in the total press, if that's what it is, and the total mass media of communication, they know what they're doing, the others don't. They know how to go about it. They've been trained, benefit of tremendous experience and training. And as a consequence, the mass media of communication have been and are overwhelmingly slanted against us and against the anti-communists. We also realize that the distribution channels for anti-communist literature were and are, by a total of various means and pressures, closed to us almost entirely. Let me give you an illustration, even though it has nothing to do directly with the society. My own much publicized, very controversial book, The Politician. I finally published it on March 10, 1963 in self-defense. It was just too awkward to have pieces taken out of context and thrown at me. No way I could answer it, because you just couldn't do it. The book is 448 pages of documentation and of history in which nobody's ever been able to find an error. And when it takes 448 pages of history and footnotes to prove something, you can't answer a charge in one sentence on television. So I published the book. And there were at least 100 newspapers in the United States quoting from it, misquoting from it, smearing it every week. It's probably had more controversial attention in the press than any book in the last, maybe in this century, the total. And the day we brought it out, a blanket descended. And not one of those papers has ever reviewed it. It almost never mentioned it, certainly not for a year or two, till now they sort of again. But at a time when they were so afraid people might buy it and read it and judge it for themselves, just an absolute blanket. Not a review, not a mention in the press for months and months. We took a full-page ad, a full-page ad in the New York Times, cost me about $7,000 to announce the book. It was published, just a plain, dignified ad that the politician was available. And I mailed a copy of that ad to every commercial bookstore in the United States, 6,810 at that time. The retail price was $8. The discount was 40%. They could make $3.20 a volume. A friend of mine took the book to the Harvard Co-op, which is one of the biggest bookstores in America as far as volume of books goes, tremendous volume. Went in to see the manager of the book department, showed it. He said, "Oh, boys, can I use that? Boy, I can sell them." And the $3.20 a piece profit appealed to him. He said, "Fine. How many come in a case?" My friend said 18. He said, "Good. Give me 5 cases to start with. We'll pile them up here, and we'll move them in no time." My friend said, "I'm sure you will." And the buyer said, "There's just one thing," said, "every single order in this store from any department has to be initialed by the merchandise manager. That's a rule, formality, and he's not here right now, so can you come back in about 45 minutes to get your actual order?" My friend said, "Sure." He went back in 45 minutes, and the merchandise manager for the whole store was there. He said, "What's this all about? What is it you want to sell us?" So my friend showed him the book, and this fellow says, "Okay, we'll take 5. My friend said, "But the manager wants to buy 90 and make a display. You can't make a display with 5. And the merchandise manager said, "I know you can't, and we're not going to, and if you don't want 5, you better just give us 3. If you don't want that, none at all. But you have an order for 3, which I'll sign." And we shipped him, or I shipped him 3, and that's all they ever bought. And this is an item they knew they could make a lot of profit on. I could tell you other stations all over the country. Now, I bring it up merely for an illustration of how the distributing channels are closed to us. Now, they're even closed worse when the item has to go through the ordinary pocketbook, magazine, pamphlet distribution channels. That's American News and Barkalow Brothers and Fred Harvey and a dozen smaller ones around the country. And most Americans don't even begin to realize how this system works. Those people never buy anything, you see. All they do in running into tens of millions of dollars is to take it on consignment. And they put it out, and whatever they sell, they eventually pay for. And if they don't, they send it back to you. Costs you either 2 cents a piece to get them back, or 1 cent a piece, or 4 cents a piece. It's varied now. I've lost track a little bit. It used to be 2 cents a piece if you got them back clean, 1 cent a piece if they had a black crayon on the cover, or if the cover was torn off. And so you could ship, just say you take a small quantity, 100,000 of any item through one of these wholesale distributors, and if it's a periodical, monthly, next month another 100, next month another 100, because that's the way they do it. It's about 4 or 5 months before you get an accounting. And I know one man who got into a very serious situation because he had a magazine, very nice looking one. He didn't understand the system at all. He sold American News 100,000 copies, and he thought it was wonderful. He reported to his board of directors. They'd bought 100,000 copies this. The next month, another 100, next month, another 100. About 4 months later, he started getting them back. He got 80,000 copies back out of the first month. They'd only sold 20,000. He had to pay for getting the 80,000 back, and you figure it out. Now, they have many, many ways today. You can't blame the management entirely, although the management could do something about it if they wanted to. The control, the influence is all the way up and down and through the line. I'll give you an illustration that I know specifically, because again it's in my own experience. I wrote a little book called May God Forgive Us in 1951 on the sellout of China, the firing of General MacArthur. And it was published by Regnery in February 1952. And Regnery sold 100,000 copies. to American News. Union News Company, which you people all see the stores in the different railroad and airline stations and all, is a retail division of American News. Gregory sold 100,000 copies of May God Forgive Us in a paperback pamphlet edition, the retail price of which was 35 cents, as I remember. I think it was either 35 or 50, I think it was 35. To American News, and they put it, supposedly, they were supposed to, in the railroad station newsstands all over the United States. They have, those days they had, I don't know today, about 165 wholesale points. So you ship 500 to one and 500 to another and 1,000 to another and so forth. And in some places they did. The result wasn't too bad in this case, even though this was what they call a one-shot. It's not a periodical. It actually got out in a lot of places and put out and sold. The total sale was 67,000 copies, and Regnery had to take back 33,000, which in this case didn't bother a thing because by this time we were selling so. We sold over 200,000 copies that year in '52 of the book in this paper format. So this was not a disaster. But the point I'm coming to, how many they would have sold, but for even the certain amount of sabotage there was then, nobody knows. Because I can give you all kinds of illustrations. I'll give you one. A lady in Seattle learned about the book from her daughter or sister in the East, who insisted that she buy a copy and was told that it was handled by American News. And she could buy it from any retail store that was supplied wholesale by American News. So she goes into her nearest newsstand or drugstore and asks for a copy of May God Forgive Us. And they tell her they don't carry it. And she asked, why not? Because their wholesaler doesn't supply it. And she says, isn't your wholesaler American News? Yes, it is. Well, American News does supply it, and they have it, and I know. All right, madam, we'll find out. So the next week she goes back, and they tell her that they've asked, and they've checked, and American News doesn't have it, and doesn't carry it, and she's wrong, she's mixed up somewhere. So she goes to the Seattle office and warehouse of American News, and she goes in and asks them why they are not distributing May God Forgive Us, because she hadn't been able to buy it in the stands where she'd tried to get it. Now again, they tell her they never heard of it, don't know what she's talking about. She says, you carry it. Oh, no, we do not. I know you do carry it. I know American News carries it and has distributed it to their wholesale places around the country. And this fellow she was talking to was apparently perfectly innocent. He may not have been. He says, okay, madam, if you know so much, the door's not locked. You go on out in our warehouse and find it. She said, okay, thank you, I will. And she went out and found 8 cases out there, never been opened, sitting right there all the time. Somebody was keeping them from ever going out onto the stands to have any chance to sell. And you ought to find out what happened to American Mercury when McGuire was trying to run it. It cost McGuire at least $1 million just from the sabotage of American Mercury through the distributing channels before he had to give up. We've had our members in Florida, not that we were ever so enthusiastic over the Mercury, but it still was one of the papers that was getting some information about the communist out. We've had our members in Florida go into retail stores where the clerk would swear on a stack of Bibles they didn't have American Mercury and never seen it. And the member would get so mad, would go around behind the counter and reach down under and pull out 11 copies out of 12 that had been delivered there out of that much book. That kind of thing was going on. And it goes on with so much influence exerted in so many different places. They will do everything. They'll cover it up on the stands, they will leave it on the trucks, and so forth and so on, because it's not all at one spot where this influence is felt. They have it at different places wherever they can find it. But you have so much sabotage that nobody can possibly sell a truly anti-communist periodical on the newsstands in America today. It can be done only in the way we are now doing it, and of course this is very limited and difficult, and you've got to have a very loyal, dedicated, faithful group to do it. Our members, we now have over 1,100 members, who as volunteers are buying American Opinion, our magazine, some of them 12, some 24, some as high as 100, shipped to them every month, and they go out for nothing and put them on the newsstand counters of their local drugstores in their area. 6 or 8 or 10 or 15 newsstand racks. And if the truck driver or the salesman for the local wholesale news service comes in and puts them down under the counter or covers them up completely with other magazines, Our members have to keep looking all the time to watch this and pull them out, put them so they can be seen again. Or get a very friendly drugstore proprietor who will sort of watch them for them. And we had 1,137, the last report I saw, members doing that, and it's growing all the time. We'll have 2,000 presently. And that's how we're building up a little bit of newsstand sales. But if we could put American Opinion today on the newsstands through American News, we'd be, without question, 200,000 or 300,000 paid circulation. Now, I could go to American News tomorrow, almost without question. They'd buy 100,000 copies of American Opinion. They wouldn't buy less than that. I'm not sure they'd buy that few. See, here again, it's like a speed limit, where the speed limit is you can't go below 40 miles an hour. With them, the question is how few they will buy, because they can't work with too few, and it costs them nothing. But they probably would buy as few as 100,000 even today. And they'd buy another 100,000 for the next 4 or 5 months if you want to use the word buy. But nobody knows what's happened to them until 4 or 5 months later when you get the accounting, and I might get 95,000 of them back from each month. So you can't possibly do it. So we knew all of this, and as a matter of fact, I was lucky that I did know as much about it as I did from the fact that I was dealing with these people all of my business life. See, they are huge candy buyers. They used to be very good people and wonderful buyers of candy, and they have a big volume. It runs into a huge volume of candy that goes through them. So you get to know them and know some of the other things too. And the development I'm talking about is all fairly recent, and some of it the management doesn't know itself, and some of it, some parts of the management are a party to, and so forth. It's like everything else. In this picture, it's all divided and diffused. But anyway, we realized that this was closed off to us. We realized that the book publishing industry had been taken over. Even the possibility of getting conservative or especially anti-communist books published had become extremely restricted. At one time, actually, it was down to practically 3 small firms: Henry Regnery Company, Caxton, out in Idaho, and Devon Adair. They were just about the only places you had any chance of getting a really firm anti-communist book published. So we set out to create our own channels of distribution, our own media where necessary, and to help to enlarge the number and reach of those which were still hanging on, as in the book publishing. And the order in which I'm going to present these steps that we have taken is neither chronologically correct nor of any importance, but the order is simply for my present convenience. One of the things we have done is to set out to establish bookstore units, as we projected in the Blue Book 7 years ago. We call them reading rooms that sell books, and we want them thought of as that, where members can bring other conservatives and sit and let them browse all they want, but if they want to buy one of the books, they can buy them too. We now have 320, the last I knew, of those bookstore units. We are driving towards 1,000. They are opening up about 2 a week right now, which is pretty good. I won't go into all the growing pains of what we had to learn to go through. Some of it's been pretty rough. Always the tendency is to go downtown, take a big store with high rent. We argue against it, everything we can. Get out the edge, the suburbs, and have plenty of parking space and very low rent. But our biggest problem was, whether it was out in the suburbs or what, they'd get together $1,000 maybe to put in a grass rug and a few tables and some wooden shelves. They'd send us an order for $1,000 worth of books. We have to supply them practically all, because they can't afford to buy 5 books from this publisher and 1 from that, and 1 from that, and 2 from that. We have to get the best discounts we can and give them enough discount to make a gross profit. So they'd send us an order for $1,000 worth of books to start. $1,000 worth of books doesn't go very far, even in the shelves of a specialty store. And we'd ship it to them, and in about 2 weeks, we'd get a check for $200 and an order for $300 worth of books. And the next week, we'd get a check for $300 and an order for $500 worth of books. And the next week, we'd get the same thing until they'd run up to about $4,000 indebtedness before they knew it. And sometimes they weren't selling enough books. And there were a lot of problems. Now, you see, nobody has ever been able to chain bookstores. That's one kind of retail unit that must be the hardest of all units to run on the chain principle. We're not stupid enough to think we can do something that is economically impossible to other people in the system. So we've tried to do it a little differently, and we have one advantage that is tremendous. The real expense of a bookstore is the clerk hire. That's more than all the other expenses put together. We have no clerk hire. All of these are manned by volunteers, by our members. We won't let anybody open one where they're not within very close reach of at least 5 chapters, which means 75 to 100 people to draw on. They've got to have some hard-boiled man or woman or committee who finds the volunteers, get them listed, decides who will substitute when anybody is sick or out, and then rides herd on them and makes them live up to it, and no kidding. So the stores are kept open the hours they should be. They can, therefore, make a gross profit, which will cover their rent, they don't have too heavy, their telephone bills and miscellaneous expenses. They are coming along very well, and when we get 1,000 of these stores, it'll take at least $1 million in capital just for servicing those stores and for the receivables. So it hadn't been easy, and it still isn't, but they are growing, and they're doing quite a job, and they're going to become quite a factor. And as a matter of fact, the other publishers, we buy from just about exactly 100 publishers now. All of them, even the most left-wing, they've all got something that we need or can buy. One of the most left-wing in America has been very smart and has 2 or 3 good books with big names that are real anti-communist books that they put out. And we buy a lot from this particular one. They are all waking up to what we can do and beginning to get a little more interested in our business and giving us better discounts. We need a minimum of 46%, which is the so-called national wholesalers discount, but we know very well that there is such a thing as 50. We're getting 50% now. When we get 46, we can give our stores 35 and get by. That's all we want to do is get by. If they can get 35 profit, a lot of stuff they have to carry, they can only get 20 on or 10. Some of these specialty items, the most we can get is 20%. If we give them 10, we don't even get by. We're getting them in and out. But anyway, we're getting better discounts and getting the point recognized that we have become a factor in the picture. We can take any book now that's any good, and these people know this, and be sure of selling 100,000 copies if we go to work on it. And the fact that we can take anything that's good, and the author can be sure, or the publisher can be sure of a sale of 100,000 copies, not in hardbound, but in paperbound. Of a hardbound that's good, we can be absolutely certain of selling, say, 10,000 copies. And it's a lever. Now, I could tell you a lot more about the bookstores. It's quite an interesting field, but I've got a lot of ground to cover. So let's go on to the second step in which we are trying to get over these obstacles, which we are trying to get the truth about both recent history and current events into as many hands and heads as we can. And this has been quite important. We have worked to see that the circulation of conservative periodicals was expanded as rapidly as it could be done without too much waste. And our members have done a grand job there. We have tried to inspire it, initiate it in some cases. We bought at one time enough when we were smaller. One issue of Dan Smoot Report, we actually bought it and paid for it for every one of our members and sent it to them so they'd all see it, to urge them to subscribe to the Dan Smoot Report. We have done what we could to increase the circulation of the Dan Smoot Report, National Review, Human Events, The Wanderer. We've helped to get a lot, I'm sure the Matt brothers will tell you, a lot of subscribers for The Wanderer, and many others. Now, we've also set out to do this job of increasing understanding through periodicals by our own publishing. I mentioned American Opinion. And for the first 2 or 3 years, we couldn't do anything about it except just carry it along, try to keep it as a very good, dependable magazine with about 5,000 circulation. Then we began to go to work on it, as we have been doing more and more in the last year or two, and American Opinion is now up to a paid circulation of over 40,000. Now that sounds very small against some of the big circulation media, but when you remember that the kind of publication that contributed so much to what's happened in America, the Nation, the New Republic, the Reporter, and all, none of them ever reached over around 30 30,000 circulation at the most. The fact that American Opinion is over 40,000 paid circulation is some encouragement. We think we can carry it a lot further. We also have out a greatly expanded weekly called Correction Please and Review of the News. 24 pages of Review of the News and 8 pages then of Correction Please, which is items we pick up out of the press to show how they were presented and how wrong they were, and give you those items corrected. And we think that the potential there is quite large, that we can spread this very rapidly. The people responsible for it are quite enthusiastic and are giving it a lot of thought. We are not kidding about it. At considerable cost, we're taking the complete wire service, both for photo and news, be ticking away in our place all the time, all day long, so that we have the real sources to draw from, and we're going at it professionally. I think it's going to take off pretty well. Give us a chance to get news out that is truth, objectively. We're not going to try to have one bit of propaganda about it, just to get the news out. A third category of effort here, all of these are in line with what we projected 7 years ago and said we would try to do, has been to do our best to support, maintain, increase the number of stations used by, and widen the audiences of such television and radio programs as those of Clarence Mannion, Dan Smoot, Fulton Lewis, Paul Harvey, Billy James Hargis, Carl McIntyre, and others. And as in the case of periodicals, we've never let the criticisms of ourselves stand in the way. We have been terrifically lambasted at times by Fulton Lewis and also by Paul Harvey. Just why, it's hard to say. But we have been. We've never let it interfere in the slightest with our urging people to listen to them and doing what we could to get our members to help to get stations for them or keep them on stations. And both our members and the society have in some cases done a great deal to help in some of these situations. Maybe the help is mostly to keep the enemy from closing in. The total audiences being reached by these really, truly anti-communist broadcasters on television and radio both today is much larger than it was 7 years ago, despite the fact that the obstacles they face, the pressures against them, the moves to get them out, to push them off of radio stations, television stations, the efforts to damage their opportunities have increased terrifically in many, many fields, including some of the actions of the FCC, which have been visibly aimed at trying to damage, harm, create obstacles for the broadcasters in the conservative or anti-communist field. Despite all of that, why, the total audience reached is larger instead of smaller. A fourth category of effort has been letter writing. It's a powerful tool, ready at hand. Everybody could understand it. And our members took to it very early and with a lot of vigor and enthusiasm. We have not planned the use of letter writing at all in the form of broadsides all over the landscape, but to be directed like bullets at specific targets, and not so much at Congress, because, among various other reasons, there are many others already doing that. Mrs. Seth Milliken's Public Action in New York does a grand job. They're good people. We've always urged our members to help and support it. So did Trudy Bale's network of letter writers on the West Coast. And Trudy died about a year ago, but it's being carried on by other very good people who'd worked with her. And their whole job is writing letters. And they publish a little news sheet on what bills are before Congress and what they mean, and ask their members to write. And both organizations. There are other groups, especially those that are working on a specific problem that have their members write letters. So we have, in the main, held up letter writing to Congress, except when and where, and without doing it too often, we thought bringing our support in might be a margin of difference, or might help at a particular time, and where it would be the most helpful. Because I'm going to give you some illustrations to show what does happen when we really turn our members loose in a letter writing job. Some of it is rather interesting, and we're going to take some illustrations. I'm going to give you at least 3 illustrations, and they will be each one quite different in many ways, and different in time and nature. One is way back when the society was quite young, and one sort of in the middle, and one far more recent. That our members have engaged in some well over 200 letter writing campaigns. And in many cases, you can't tell how successful you've been. There's no way of measuring it. In some cases, you can. We've never had but one, to the best of my knowledge, in which we absolutely 100% failed, got no place at all. And this was a letter writing campaign to insist that the major airlines, American, United, and Eastern, were the 3 we tackled, put either Human Events or National Review in their reading racks so that there would be some conservative publication for the travelers on the planes to read. And we just didn't get anywhere. We didn't get them to listen. Now, that was quite a while back. We're going to go at it again, and this time we're going after American Opinion. We think it's become the most influential conservative magazine in America. I think we could prove that, and it's a very good format. And we're going to start a new campaign to get them to put American Opinion on the reading racks. And I think we will get somewhere this time, but we sure didn't before. We've had other campaigns in which you couldn't tell, and some in which we very definitely won completely, hands down. Now, one of the first letter writing campaigns in which we engaged was when the society was quite small. In the spring of 1959, we learned that the UNESCO crowd had set out to have the department stores of America completely change their Christmas decorations. Instead of the holly and mistletoe and the creche, the religious items, everything was to go out, and all of the decoration in the windows and throughout the department stores was to be United Nations insignia and United Nations paraphernalia, and the whole Christmas season and spirit was to be converted into a festival in support of and honoring the United Nations, the brotherhood of man under the United Nations. It was pretty clever, because Christmas is a period when you, of course, have a feeling of goodwill towards your fellow men. They were going to take that and convert that feeling into a glorification of the United Nations and the brotherhood of man under the United Nations. And ladies and gentlemen, this thing had gone quite a ways. They had had a complete rehearsal at Bamberger's store in Newark that fall before the Christmas season of 1958, and they had considered it very successful. That's why they decided to go ahead. And I don't know whether you know how much paraphernalia the United Nations have, but they can give you more gimcracks and more signs and more ways of putting up that insignia of theirs and the We Believe business than you'd dream possible. So they'd gone to work on the department stores of America. Plans had been made to do it all over the United States, and already some of the department stores had agreed. When we learned about it, this was about April 1959. And so we had an article written to order, kept it to exactly 2,000 words, so it would fit 4 pages on American Opinion and make a nice reprint as just a one-sheet flyer. Opened it up as 4 pages, called There Goes Christmas, in which we pointed out what they were trying to do, and we based our campaign around this drive to take Christ out of Christmas, which is exactly what they were trying to do on the negative side. On their positive side, they were going to make it, as I say, a means of glorifying the United Nations. There is a tremendous underlying material to this thing that I'll come to presently. This was just part of a much more sinister and a much larger plan. But anyway, we had this written, There Goes Christmas, and we wrote our members, and we told them what was going to happen, what they were trying to do, and we said, each of you write to either the chairman of the board or the president or the executive vice president of one or more department stores in your area or your city. If you happen to know any one of these executives in some one department store, write the one you know. If not, well, write the one that seems to be the chief executive, and write some executive of every one of the department stores within your range, and send with your letter this 4-page folder that explains it. We hammered that home. Don't try to explain it all yourself. Write a short note and just send this 4-page folder. And we explained that these men are busy and they're not going to take time to read a handwritten 2- or 3-page or 4-page scrawl, or the 5 or 6 pages it would take for our members all to try to explain it differently, and they wouldn't get it too right anyway in many cases, where this had been carefully done and it had the whole story there. We said, you write, enclose this and refer to it and tell the executive that this will explain what it's all about, and that as a customer of his store, if you are, that you're going to be quite disturbed if next Christmas you find UN insignia there instead of the conventional decorations you're accustomed to. If you're not a customer of the store, don't pretend to be, but say that since the store is in your community and you're interested in its welfare and what it does, that you, just as an interested citizen or friend, you'd like to write and say you've heard this report, this rumor, and you hope it isn't true. And you hope that when next Christmas season comes and you're in that part of the town and go by, that you will find the usual Christmas decorations in their windows and in their store. And enclose this and ask them to read it. And we said, don't let it bother you that everybody else writing, these same people will enclose this. They won't read it at once, but the fact that it's enclosed is still going to simplify the picture. Now, I might interpolate here, ladies and gentlemen, that you hear over and over that these organized letter-writing campaigns are no good and don't do any good because everybody can tell they're organized and the congressman knows that they're organized and therefore he pays no attention. You usually find you run that down, that's some left-winger that is saying that doesn't want anybody to write the letters because it just ain't true. We know it isn't true. If the letters are written by people, responsible citizens who sign their names and give their address, they can be worded almost identically the same and they'll have a tremendous impact, whether it's on congressmen, department store managers, or newspaper editors, or who. It can be organized all at once, but the fact that the individual has been willing to write it and do it is what counts. So we told our members not to worry about that aspect of this and go ahead. Now, at that time, we had only 60 chapters. Fortunately, they were scattered all over. We had a few in California, just because of the way we'd happened to get started. We had a couple very good ones in Detroit. We had a few in Florida, a few in Massachusetts. The 60 chapters were widely scattered over the country, but that's all we had by that time, which meant about maybe 700 or 800 members. That's our total membership. This is when the society was just getting started. So we said, look, obviously we are not strong enough. We don't have enough people to do this job, but we can be the spark. We can be the lever. Now, you not only write yourself, every one of you, to all the department stores you know, to some executive, but you go to the local chapter of the DAR and have some copies of this and show them, see if you can get them to do it. Go to your local American Legion post and see if they can do it. Go ahead and each of you buy enough, 100 or 1,000 of these things to use for this, and write your friends all over the United States and other areas and tell them to read this and ask them to send it to the department stores in their town. The job is to multiply our size, magnify our effort in every way we can by us being the spark that does it. Well, naturally, the members we had were very dedicated. They went to work on it, and very hard. And I'll cut the story short. We won it hands down. It was only about 6 weeks when the members began to send letters in to me they'd received, and the letters would say, Dear Mrs. Smith, we frankly had thought that this was going to be quite a fad, quite the thing. We had decided, we'd made plans to go ahead and substitute United Nations insignia and other items for the conventional decorations next fall. But we have had quite a number of letters like yours. It's caused us to reconsider, and we are changing our minds and want to let you know that we're going back to conventional decorations. Some of the other letters would say, Dear Mrs. Smith, we have your letter and thank you. We had not made up our minds. We were considering whether or not we would follow this strongly pushed idea of having this become the fad for all the department stores to use UN insignia. We were given it serious consideration. We had not committed ourselves. And because of the letters we've received like yours and the strength of the feeling shown, we have now made up our minds that we're not going to do it. We're going to stick by conventional decorations. The third form of letter would say, "Dear Mrs. Smith, we thank you very much. This had been presented to us. We gave it consideration. We didn't want to do it. We didn't like it. We didn't know how much we'd be running against the tide, and we're greatly encouraged to find from your letter and others that there is this feeling supporting ours, and we just want to let you know that we are not going to do it and hadn't planned to or wanted to." And the consequence is they had to drop it. And they didn't go through with it, and you didn't see it, and they haven't dared come back and start to try it since then again. You're going to see it again in another year or two. These people never give up. But we were able to stop it then. Now, there was a great deal more involved. This was going to be a fad that practically every department store had to follow, and the minute they had this in, then they were going to go to work on others. The basic underlying plan here was completely to break down the real significance of all of our religious holidays and all of our patriotic holidays. They were going to convert Christmas, the whole season, into a celebration in honor of the brotherhood of man under the United Nations, a completely atheistic approach, actually. They were going to make Easter, and they will still try. This all goes back to the French Revolution. The planning for so much happening right now was done by the same people in the French Revolution, of which these are the heirs. They were going to try to make Easter, and they still will, a spring fertility festival in honor of the fertility of the land and of nature and so forth, and take all religious significance out of our religious holidays. And they were going to try, and they have made more effort in this way, to completely change our patriotic holidays. They've been able pretty well now to drop Washington's birthday. You practically don't even see it celebrated. And you must remember that the last two presidents of the United States have used July 4, Independence Day, as the day and the occasion for a major speech in honor of the interdependence of the United States on other nations, the exact opposite of our independence. This is all part of a pattern which was set out far back, and of which this was a major psychological part because of the effect it would have had. And I think I can say honestly to you that without us, they would have done it, would have gone in, would have become the fad, and would have stayed there. I think we won that and can claim credit for having stopped that particular drive of what I would consider to be the communist forces, no matter how it may have been disguised and twisted, and certainly through UNESCO you've got preponderant communist influence. We succeeded in stopping that drive of what they were trying to do.